In this video I'm going to cover installing the subdeck and deck pieces for a boat. This is a pretty major step. It's kind of one of those milestone steps that really is critical in getting the build moving, and then allows you to work on a bunch of different aspects or parts of the build as you desire. It's probably also one of the more complex assemblies in terms of fiberglassing it into the boat. It's probably the most complex fiberglassing job throughout the entire build. Just kind of quick overview of what we're talking about. So, the deck goes on top of the hull. You'll see here there's kind of like two layers. So this lower layer we'll call the subdeck, which really gives the hull structural support, because the fiberglass hull alone will flex a fair amount without any support. And then the upper layer will be the actual deck. We can call it like the deck rim. And then you'll have the deck pieces or hatches or whatever you want to call them, which will be, the parts where you mount your guns and the superstructure on, that are generally removable from the boat. In general, the subdeck would be thicker than the actual deck pieces, so for the rules you're limited up to 3/8 inch thick at the top edge of the hull of impenetrable area. So typically you'll see a 1/4 inch subdeck and then a 1/8 inch thick deck. Alternatively, like on this boat, I think both the subdeck and the deck rim there are both 3/16, but the deck pieces are only 1/8, and then I have like a silicone compound that kind of provides that extra 1/16 of thickness and provides a good sealing surface. The Missouri here is kind of more traditional with the 1/4 inch and the 1/8 inch. I like to put the deck in at this point. So what's been accomplished so far: the drivetrain's installed, the rudder mount's installed, windows are cut out, and the water channeling is done. All of those steps are kind of critical before putting in the deck, because they require kind of access through the entire top of the hull. And if you had the deck rim installed when trying to work on the water channeling, for instance, it would be difficult. And from the drivetrain perspective, you want to know where the motors are prior to putting in the deck, so you can understand where you want your cross members to go. So the general process here, the material I'll use will be aircraft grade plywood. So this is a 3/16 inch 1 foot by 4 foot piece of plywood. Actually, I'll also use kind of some of those bigger pieces in the back there, because I have 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch, and 3/16 inch. And the general process will be tracing out the hull, tracing out the subdeck and the thickness and the cross members, cutting that out, and then repeating the process for the deck. Another material people use is they'll use like basswood strips. This is a 1/4 inch square basswood strip, and they'll just kind of like build the subdeck up by clamping a number of these along the side, which works, but I prefer the plywood method, because I think you end up with a better product. One thing I kind of glossed over that's important to figure out is determining what thickness you want to use for the deck and subdeck. So the way that you figure that out is you determine like what material you want the deck pieces to be, which is this piece, removable piece. And then you also want to know or have an idea of what method of deck hold down or deck seal you're going to use. The basic rule of thumb would be, like I said before, just use 1/8 inch deck pieces and then a 1/4 inch thick subdeck. You can also do equal, so 3/16, both of them, if you want like a sturdier deck piece. So I'll just show Congo here. So Congo, because it kind of has a range. So in this boat, the deck piece here is 1/4 inch, but you can kind of see I reinforced it a little bit because this is kind of like a relatively long piece, and I have guns and solenoids in there. So there's a fair amount of weight on this piece. So if I only use the 1/8 inch, it might flex, which is not ideal. And what I did in the stern is kind of a little more unique, which is why I'm showing Congo. So I used these, I use magnetic tape as the deck seal. You can get this at like any hardware store, but you can see you got some on the deck piece and then on the deck rim here. This stuff makes a really good seal, which for this boat, it runs really low in the water, so the stern will actually be underwater a lot of times, so having a good seal is important. So in this case, I used, actually, you can kind of see the red material there. So the red material is just 1/16 inch thick fiberglass. So as you can imagine, that's really flimsy, so what I then did is I reinforced it. So this is a 1/8 inch piece of plywood, kind of inset, so it doesn't interfere with the deck rim. So that 1/8 inch thick plywood gives the fiberglass the strength it needs. And then at top, I have the standard 1/8 inch thick plywood. And then on the deck rim, so this top piece is actually a 1/4 inch thick, because accounting for the thickness of the magnetic tape, which if there was no adhesive, it would only be 1/8 of an inch, so you could make this 3/16, and I've done that on other boats before. But once you add the adhesive, I found it's better to have this as a 1/4 inch when kind of all the thickness adds up. And then underneath, the subdeck is actually 3/16, so that's, the total thickness is thicker than 3/8 here. But what I did was I just tapered the outboard edge, so where the assembly attaches to the hull, it's only 3/8 inch thick to not violate that requirement. You'll end up having to do the same thing if your boat, so like Fuso back there in the pile, this deck rim is only a 1/4 inch thick, so when I put in the deck for Fuso, I'll have to taper it at least 1/8 of an inch to get from 3/8 down to a 1/4 inch, so the hull is legal. But in general, rule of thumb, if you don't know what to do, just use 1/8 inch thick deck and deck pieces, and then a 1/4 inch subdeck, and you'll be good. If you want to do something different like I did here on Congo, then I need to think about it a little bit more. You can also see the number of cross pieces on Congo. So I have one kind of like right in the middle, and then one by the stern. And the stern one is to kind of help support the deck with the guns and the solenoids on it. So it's pretty typical for boats to have one pretty near the middle, and you just try to deconflict it with the motor location and any gun location. You can see there that for Congo, I didn't put the cross member right at the step because it would have interfered with the turret, and that would have been an issue. For this boat, because it's longer than standard plywood length of 4 feet, I have to determine where I want the brake to be between the two pieces of plywood. So in this case, I'm going to use that to my advantage, and I'm going to use different thickness deck and subdeck in the very stern relative to the rest of the ship. So in the very stern, what I'm going to do is I'll probably use a setup like I have on the Congo with the 16th inch fiberglass deck and the magnetic tape as the deck seal. The reason is because it creates a really good deck seal. And then also I'm planning so another factor I'm considering is, because this boat is going to have triple sterns, the accumulation tank and the solenoid is going to go right here, and I'm going to use the thicker 1/4-inch tubing to go to the guns. So that tubing is less movable. So I'm going to want kind of short pieces going directly to the bottom of the guns, which will be like right here, 3 of them. So I want to plan to leave the aftmost deck piece in the boat most of the time. It'll be removable, so it can come out if something's wrong with the rudder, or I don't know, something I have to change the motor out, for instance. But throughout a normal battle or normal event, I wouldn't plan to move it because these hoses are probably going to be really tight. So what I need to do is figure out where I'm going to put the cross members to kind of support the boat. So I have this piece right here, so the aft turret goes right about here. I had you can see the line drawn there. So you don't want to put a cross member right up against the turret, because I'm probably going to use 3D printed turrets, and then the bottom flange of the turret is going to extend out greater than the diameter of the turret, so you need to at least have like a 1/2 inch or so between the turret and where the cross member is going to be, or else they'll run into each other. And then the other concern is being able to service the rudder and the rudder servo. So because this boat is long, there's a lot of space here. On other boats, it's going to be kind of more cramped, where the aft turret might be right up against where the rudder is, so you got to be a little more strategic, or put a little more thought into exactly where the cross member is going to go. So in this case, it's kind of flexible. It could probably go anywhere from around here, so you want to make sure you have access to the screws that are going to hold the rudder servo in. So you wouldn't want it right here, because then you can't get a screwdriver in there. And then the extreme end would be right up against the turret, so probably put it somewhere around there, so it's close to the turret, so it'll still give the deck piece support, so it doesn't sag under the weight of the triple guns. And it also gives ample room to service the rudder, which will be kind of nice. So typically, if I'm just going to use an aft piece, I would want another cross member like around here. So you see I have a gun magazine laid out for length. So typically, you'd want a piece like another cross member here, and then you just have one deck piece that will go from here either to here, or here all the way aft. But in this case, you can kind of see there's no real good spot for the cross member. So I could put the cross member right here, but then the gun magazines are going to kind of be stuck under it. And if you couple that with the short length of hose here, it would kind of be almost impossible to get the deck on and off with a cross member there. So things you want to make sure you have access to are the front bolt holes for the motor on the motor mount. So you want to be able to put your hand in front of the motor, because that's where it is, or that's the spot you're going to need to get access to those. So put the cross member right here. It's going to be hard to get a little Allen wrench in there. I know this because on my sablets it's kind of like that, and it is a huge pain to change a motor out if you need to, or to undo one of the set screws on the gear on the motor shaft or the prop shaft. And then because this one has the outboard motor, it's kind of same thing applies for this area, so I wouldn't want a cross member right here, because then I'm not going to be able to get to that motor, or it's just going to be a lot more of a pain. And then you can see where the pump goes. So the pump is something you want to have access to very easily during a battle, between sorties, because you want to pull the pump out, clean the screen off any debris that kind of accumulates there. So that's not going to work. Then you can move it kind of up this way. But if you remember, I kind of had the bottle configured like right here. So if I needed to, like if this hull was warped or distorted, and I was worried about the subdeck being able to hold it out on its own, I would probably go, somewhere around here just to clear the pump so I can get that out. But I don't think I need one for this boat, so I'm just not going to use one. So what I'll do is I'll make the plywood break. I think I marked it. Make the plywood break around here, because I'm going to use the different thicknesses. So I'll use the fiberglass and the magnetic tape for this aft portion here, and I'll probably just have it be one long deck piece, because I anticipate doing something like this where I have a little aimer or a thing to hold the barrel tips, so I space the guns out correctly so they hit together. So you can kind of see, like, you wouldn't want to put a break in the deck here, because you have to, the turret has to be on the same piece as the holder. So in this case, because the turret's right here, and then you do like 5 inches for the barrel, it's going to span the cross member, so I'll just do one kind of solid piece from about right here aft. And then because I'm going to use the fiberglass, I'll do a 1/4 inch thick at the top and then 3/16 underneath, taper it at the edge so it doesn't violate the rules. And then the rest of the boat, I'll just do kind of the standard deck, so 1/4 inch subdeck, 1/8 inch deck, because this long middle portion will kind of just be superstructure. And then the forward cross member, I'll put kind of right about here. I'll put that right about here, maybe a little bit further forward, so you can see where the turrets are, so you don't want to put it right where the turrets are. But kind of probably about here, because the superstructure on this boat kind of spans, all the way from the B turret to C turret, so this kind of whole area is like one big piece of superstructure. So most of that will just be attached to this main deck piece, but there's no gun, so the main deck piece will actually be pretty light. And then I'll probably, because I'm going to have a deck split here without a cross member, so I'll have to kind of reinforce those deck pieces so they don't sag in the middle. Or like maybe I'll do like a little like mini overlap where I have the aft piece have a little flange that goes underneath that this piece can kind of sit on top of. Okay, so now that I finally have a plan, I'll kind of go about lining up, getting the pieces of wood selected. Built a lot of boats, so I have a lot of scrap pieces of wood, so find the smallest piece that will fit the application. So I'll kind of trace out, one piece for the aft portion, and then I'll use probably a full piece or a near full piece for the bow portion, and I'll do the subdeck first and get that figured out. And then once I have the subdeck all cut out, I will use that as a template for tracing out the deck rim piece. It makes it a lot easier. So I'll briefly explain two different methods of tracing the hull out. The first method is just directly tracing the hull onto the wood. So you can see here I have kind of a small scrap piece of wood that's kind of an odd shape, but looks like it's going to just fit. It's going to just fit where I need it to. So, I could use a whole fresh piece, but I'd rather save that for another boat. So I'll just use this scrap piece. You can see here I just kind of clamped it, and then I just kind of made sure that there isn't a huge gap on either side. So you can see there's like a tiny gap there, but honestly it's really not that important because it's kind of difficult when this is done. The contact is not going to be 100% continuous, and then I'll use fiberglass mat to take up any gaps between the wood and the hull when I install it. So in this case, because the piece is like really tight relative to how big I need it to be, I clamped it on like this, and then I'll flip the whole thing over and trace it on the outside. Another thing you can do is you can try to, once it's flipped over, you can try to trace it on the inside, but you can kind of see with the windows that could be pretty difficult. And then with this boat, it's really well made, so the thickness of the fiberglass is really uniform. So what I can do is I can just take a representative measurement, and then I'll have the trace line, and then I'll just do an offset based off, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch or so, and then that'll get me a kind of ballpark when I cut this piece out and then fit it up with the hull. The first trace doesn't really need to be perfect. I mean, the closer you are, the better to the end state, but every time you install the deck, you're gonna do a first cut and then do a fair amount of additional cuts to try to get the piece to fit right, get the beam to be right, etc. Okay, so the other method, just kind of mini demo, is call this like the painter's tape method. I saw one of my friends do this online. I thought it was a really great idea, so promptly copied them. If you stick around the hobby, you'll kind of see that generally people just do things the same way, and then someone else will come up with a new idea, and then if it's a good idea and they advertise it, other people will copy them. So it's a nice kind of constructive group mentality to try to help each other out. So anyway, what you would do with this is you'd kind of cover the whole top with tape, and then go with a razor blade, so you make sure it's all kind of stuck together in the middle here. And then I'll actually usually put like strips along the top and underneath so it stays together, and then go with the razor blade and then cut right along the inside edge. And what that does is it gives you a kind of a perfect trace out of the inside dimension here, which for Scharnhorst, because it's a very smooth contour hull and it's well made, so the thickness is uniform, that's really not necessary. But you look at Fuso up here with these casements and stuff, tracing it out will be a giant pain, and it'd be much harder to get it right. It require a lot more cuts if I just did the tracing method. So for when I do fuso, I'll do the tape method and cover this entire, the whole thing, and then cut it out on the inboard side, and then that'll give you a good outline. So I'll take this, flip it over, trace it out, do the same with the forward piece, and then I'll show how I figure out how wide I'm going to make it, and then drawing the cross members. Traced out the bow portion, or really the main bulk of the length. Pretty much the same idea as the stern portion. Show a couple things. So I usually take out kind of a middle triangle in the bow, because I guess from here forward will all be solid, but you don't really need the weight of the subdeck in that area. Another thing to pay attention to on the bow is because of the shape of the bow, how it kind of like curves out as you go up. The subdeck isn't completely vertical, so the subdeck, kind of sits recessed in here a little bit. So you need to cut further in from the outer dimension than you do over the rest of the hull. So you can kind of see that here, where it's more like 3/16 than 1/8 inch along the most of the length. Another thing to do is to trace out the turret or the barbette locations. You see the two circles there, and then what you want to look for is just make sure that the subdeck isn't within the diameter of the barbette. It's not really an issue on this boat because of the beam at the gun locations, but on some other boats it's a lot narrower there. So you just have to kind of be careful about it, and sometimes you need to reduce this thickness here. Okay, I'm ready to get this cut. You can see my kind of ghetto cutting setup. I just take a chair and clamp a board onto it. Ideally you'd use a table, but my tables have too much crap on them. So what I'll do first, you can kind of see I'll drill a bunch of holes. That's going to allow to put the blade of the jigsaw through to make the cuts. One thing you want to pay attention to is make sure you know which side of the line you're going to cut on. So on the outboard edge, I'm going to cut on the right side of the line, and the inboard edge I'd cut on the left side of the line. Another thing I pay attention to is the direction of the cut relative to the grain of the wood. So because this piece generally curves in this way, or it curves in moving this way, I'm going to cut in this direction, because when the saw goes, it's going to have a tendency to cause the top layer of the plywood to kind of separate a little bit, and it'll start to like spike up a little bit, which is fine, but you'll end up with the smooth edge on the inside here. So I'll cut this way and I'll cut that way. This is pretty good plywood, so it's not a huge deal, but if you're using a cheaper piece of plywood, then that'll be more of an issue. And then, yeah, you can see the tools, so just basic jigsaw, kind of get the smallest or the finest blade you can. That one's pretty small. And then that'll allow you to make the corners. And you can see how I have this clamped, so I'll just kind of start cutting the outside cuts first, and then kind of work my way inward and rotate it around and reclamp it as necessary. So I did the first few cuts. You can see what I was talking about on this edge. See, the edge on the left is really nice, but the outboard edge is rough. So when I cut this one right here actually went the other direction. So just kind of keep going. Now I'll take this, I'll flip it around, and I'll cut out the other side.